Hello, everybody. We're going to get started here in a few minutes, just waiting on everyone to come in, but appreciate you joining. Just stay on the line and we'll get started soon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We still see a lot of people joining, so I'm just going to wait, maybe another minute or two to get things kicked off, and then we'll get things rolling. Appreciate everyone joining this webinar today, and we'll kick things off here momentarily. Great. Well, we're going to get things kicked off. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. Title of it is From Silence to Speak Up and How the World's Most Ethical Companies Build Stronger Cultures. I think this is a really exciting topic that I know, in my experience in the industry, everyone always is eager to learn more about best practices and, what's going on with their peers in the industry. So just as an introduction, I'm Tim Morris. I'm the CEO of Speak Up. I've been in the ethics and compliance industry for about 12 years, working with various companies on all sorts of different ethical matters, including culture speaking up. So really excited to be here today. And I'm joined by Doug Allen from Ethisphere. And Doug, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Doug Allen from Ethisphere, where I help lead our culture services team. And for those of you who may not be familiar with who Ethisphere is and what we do is, we're an organization that's been around for almost 20 years now. And really our ethos is, how do we help companies do good business better? And so we really do that in a variety of different ways, through measurement and evaluating compliance and ethics programs and culture, to building community and discussing best practices amongst compliance leaders around the world, but also recognition. And I think we're most famously known for our World's Most Ethical Companies program and process, which was recently announced for 2025, where we celebrate those companies who we believe are doing it the right way and sort of have a celebration around them and their practices. So, and me specifically, Tim, I work with the culture services team. So I've been spending most of my decade plus with the organization, really helping organizations around the world measure and develop their ethical cultures. And so that consists of a team doing deep dive work and looking at what are some key drivers behind the culture, what relevant elements of the compliance program are behind it, and sort of how do we improve the perception of culture and ethics within the organization. So happy to be here and happy to dive into the discussion today.
Yeah, very excited. And, sitting on the technology side, it's always interesting to speak with people like yourself. Is tech only takes you so far. So it's ultimately it's all those other things that ultimately make these programs successful. So really excited to dig into the topic. So just to give everyone an idea of the agenda and what we're going to be talking through today, we're going to talk about, what does an strong ethical culture look like? Where organizations go wrong in measuring it. And, I think that's a really, interesting topic to dig into, because I know it's something a lot of companies struggle with. why benchmarking is absolutely critical. What are the leading companies doing? How do they get it right? So I think it's a great agenda, and really excited to dig into these topics. One thing we're going to do as we kick things off is we're going to put a poll out there for everyone, and if everyone can take some time to respond to it, and then we're going to get into a conversation, and we'll loop back here shortly once we get some responses in, and dig into a dialogue on that as well. But Doug, I want to kick it over to you just with that first topic in mind. What does it mean to have a strong ethical culture? And let's just start there.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tim, and one in which there are a variety of different answers from what we've heard. But really, when looking at a strong ethical culture, it's a few different things, and we'll take it piecemeal between what the different words of that statement represent. But looking first at ethics, it really goes beyond the policies, the training, the program. It's not a program per se. It's really the framework with which employees are making decisions in the context of an organization. And so when we look at it holistically, we really distill it down to the values of both the individual and the company drive culture, and then culture, of course, drives behavior. And that's good or bad. That's either side of it. And so a lot of the work we do, both for measuring and defining what culture is, looks at you do as the compliance professional in the line today, all this work you do in building this great program with training, with written standards, with processes to investigate and dive into concerns when they arise. These formal systems you put in place, how does that align with the informal systems that live within your organization? So some examples of that is what's the culture, the corporate culture you're developing and instilling, how does that compare to the local team culture across the disparate sites of your company? Kind of an example of formal versus informal. What's the leadership expectation model and sort of how they're thinking through decisions and communicating on integrity versus the behavior and messaging of local leadership? One's a media manager. What's the dichotomy there? Looking at policies and procedures that you build, again, as compliance professionals versus what's actually being done from a process perspective on the ground outside of HQ. And so when we look at, what a good culture looks like are those informal and formal systems in alignment? How do you measure that? And then furthermore, what does it look like compared to your peers too? So we have a benchmarking component that looks at culture, but that's really how we think about it holistically. And Tim, I'm curious from your perspective in the work you do, have you arrived at a concise definition, hopefully more concise than what I just said, in terms of how you're thinking about what does it mean to have a strong culture?
Yeah, I think there's so many different perspectives on it, and it varies from company to company. I've gone through different evolutions in my time, even on simple things as like coming up with a company tagline of doing good, right? And it's a very relative term depending on where you sit, and that can vary based on what industry you're in, where you operate geographically. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see is just the differences between what's normal in North America versus Europe versus pick your place. And one of the big challenges is how do you want to drive consistency. When I sit on the technology side of it, it's like how do we drive consistency, but then how do you also incorporate the local nuance and everything from what is the perception of things like benchmark data on cases, cases per 100 employee, and is more better, and I get different opinions of that depending on where I sit, and that's not always coming from a place of malintent or anything like that, but it is truly different philosophies. Even the term whistleblowing in certain places, I've heard that where I'm like that means you're ratting somebody out rather than something like speaking up. So I think a strong culture really, technology aside, is how do you deal with all those different nuances and have the right global standard, but also how do you deal with things in a localized way, and also making sure that you're pulsing on that more than just measuring things on a statistic, which we'll get into our next topic, but just looking at stats and things like that. So it's striking the balance between what does numbers tell you versus what is the feeling on the ground. I'm curious from your perspective on some of those topics as well.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I latched onto, Tim, doing good. You had that nice, concise statement. It just means doing good. There's a lot there, however. It's intentions don't matter, actions do. And that's really why being ethical is hard. And it is the act of doing the good, making the right choice that is the reason why we're here. So I really like that concise version of that. And you're exactly right about contextualizing it for local cultures and teams. A lot of the work we do, we'll survey organizations around the world, asking their employees, how do you perceive the efficacy of the program? Do you believe your senior leadership team is demonstrating the right behaviors? Are they speaking about integrity? Do you trust your immediate manager as a resource for you to get your questions answered? Do you have faith in the investigations process? Are you comfortable speaking up? And as part of that data collection process, we do have the opportunity to segment across teams in these global companies. And your point about localizing or contextualizing how you approach culture within your organization is evident in the data we see too. The farther you get away from HQ, the more disparate or more variance we see in our data sets. So there's oftentimes opportunities that do arise sort of at the organization-wide level, but you've really got to pay attention to what's the norms at your various sites, your various countries, your various divisions, and come to the table with solutions and suggestions and recommendations that are appropriate for those teams. And when you don't, those teams recognize that. They internalize the fact that, look, this policy, this procedure, this training wasn't localized to my language. It doesn't account for sort of the way in which we operate at our site. We must not be important, right? We're not valued in the eyes of corporate. So a lot of that really resonates with me in terms of what we see in our own data, in terms of how we think about contextualizing the work we do and how we measure it as well.
Yeah,
completely agree.
Yeah, and it's one that comes from my own personal experience as an individual. I've now lived in 4 different countries, and that's been an eye-opening experience of sitting in maybe a U.S. office and having the perspective there, and then feeling you get those warm vibes of when you're sitting at headquarters and like everything's going great. Then you go somewhere and then you learn, oh, maybe there's a different feeling here. Then you move somewhere else and it's a different feeling. And then I've also sat across everything from commercial teams to product and engineering teams, and again, different feelings there. And it's, at the top, it's often the same message, but it's how that it ultimately gets delivered and how it gets written, and localization both in the geographic, but also in across different personas, just really makes an impact. And how it gets delivered is, I can tell you firsthand, the way an engineer thinks is a lot different than the way a salesperson thinks. And perceive things very differently and get caught on nuance in a much different way. So it's a real challenge, and I think it is where tooling takes you so far, but really having ambassadors and things like throughout the organization can just make such a difference. So yeah,
completely agree.
100% agree with you. Pivoting, I wanted look at the poll now. So let's go to the interactions. So on how does your culture, how does your organization currently measure ethical culture? The top response was surveys. Number 2 was case volumes, and number 3 was benchmarking, and then the rest below that. So, Doug, curious of your reaction to surveys being the predominant way. In-person site visits only at 6% compared to 62% by surveys. So just kind of with what we're talking about here, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, a little bit surprising, not too surprising, but a little bit surprising. So we gather information on the current practices of companies around the world specific to integrity and compliance programs on an annual basis. It really what drives the data collection process drives our World's Most Ethical Companies program, and a lot of the work we do in benchmarking and measuring and helping companies distill down what a good program looks like through data. And as part of that data collection process, we ask, how are you measuring culture? How often are you doing it? What does it look like? What's the depth? What's the scope? Who are the stakeholders involved? How are you following through? And so anchoring on that first point of how you do it, the top 4 responses we see among the 2025 World's Most Ethical Companies data set is surveys are ubiquitous. And especially if you carve out the European contingent of that group, every single company indicated doing surveys, 100%. They are ubiquitous, and it's not surprising. Surveys are scalable. They're relatively inexpensive. They allow you to get a quick quantitative view into perceptions, again, at scale. And so it's no surprise that they're used a lot. The pros of the methodology, as you can imagine, lead right into the cons, which is because they're easy to roll and they're easy to administer, relatively speaking, and they scale, a lot of times employees are over-surveyed. So there's a lot of survey fatigue commentary we get as part of the work we do, and sort of other compliance professionals tell us in the day-to-day engagement with their own teams that employees can't handle another survey, and management has no appetite to pull their folks off the line for another questionnaire. I'm going to set that point aside. I have a lot to say about that as well. But surveys are ubiquitous, so I'm not surprised with the results we have here. The 3 other responses we see in our own data set are surveys number one, right behind it are site visits. Almost all but two of the honorary companies we recognize this year are doing site visits, whether that is the team itself visiting locations on a rotating basis to capture insights, feedback, commentary on the ground from various teams outside of HQ. Sometimes that involves deputizing internal audit as they do their own assessments around the organization with questions, with things to probe on so they get insight as to what's happening in those locations. But number two, and a close number two, is site visits. We see a lot of activity in organizations making that effort. And the common question we get to that is, all right, what does that look like in a remote world when some offices, I know at least here in the States, we're getting pressure to get back into the office, but worldwide, we still see a lot of the organizations we work with remain remote in many respects. And so that consists of many different formats in terms of checking in through digital means, having more close ties with these teams on various chat programs and so on, and tools. So it really does vary, but we do see site visits commonly used as a number two resource. Now, 3 and 4, and again, this list is mirrored both for the honorary set overall, but also for our European contingent of those companies. Number 3 is some mix of focus groups or employee interviews. And then the fourth methodology we see is some sort of monitoring of social media sites or technology to get some sort of broad sentiment of what folks are feeling about, whether that's, again, Glassdoor, TikTok, whatever the platform may be, but we're seeing organizations pay attention to these platforms as part of that effort. So that's a lot. And so what does this mean to us? And there's 2 key takeaways when we look at the data behind how companies are measuring today. One is multiple modalities are used. And Tim, I apologize. I don't know if our poll question was multi-select. Looks like it may not have been. Yeah, okay. Yeah. But our question is, so when we ask organizations who engage with us, how are you measuring culture? Commonly, we get organizations, I think the median selection rate is about 4 to 5, 4.5 or so different modalities are used. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of surveys layered with site visits with context provided by interviews and focus groups. So to get the accurate sense of what's happening, you really can't rely on any single modality. So that's the first takeaway. At least that's what the best companies are doing. Mm-hmm. 2, you really have to pay attention to, are you both capturing the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of culture? Again, surveys are great for capturing quantitative data at scale, but without the right open text fields, without the right context through discussions, a lot of times that data lacks the nuance you need to act at a local level. So it's really, I guess, stepping away from that point is, are you contextualizing the way in which you measure so it's appropriate for your teams? As you can imagine, Tim, if I have a manufacturing organization, it's very different the way in which I ask folks how they're doing versus a retail, versus a cruise ship operation company, versus a software company. Mm-hmm. Ensuring that the modality and the approach you're using is appropriate to meet folks where they are, to get their perceptions measured appropriately. So that's sort of when I look at this poll, again, not surprised, but when it relates to our data, I see a lot of similarities and some differences as well.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. So I think that that takes us really well into one of the next topics, which is measuring culture, right? And the pitfalls of that. Right? So mm-hmm. So where do you see mistakes or maybe people go wrong or take it maybe not the ideal path when it comes to really measuring and understanding culture within their organization?
Yeah, so pitfalls that we see. We could spend a whole hour on this. We've learned a lot. We've been doing this for over a decade. We've partnered with hundreds of organizations around the world. We've measured employee feedback from right around 4 million individual employees globally. And so we've learned a lot in that journey. Broadly speaking, I'll touch on some fairly broad lessons learned, and then perhaps if I might get into some of the tactical. But in terms of broad strokes, where we see some pitfalls being made is not starting with your why first. It's kind of a platitude, but if you bear with me for a moment, it's many instances, and we're on the receiving end of this conversation, so we know a lot of times when compliance leaders have a need to measure their culture, sometimes it comes from the board, it comes from the executive leadership team saying, hey, we need to figure out what's happening. And a lot of times they just put their trust they find a vendor, they find a partner, they lean on that partner's methodology, and they just move forward accordingly. Now that'll get you most of the way there, but really what we always encourage folks to do is start with your why. What questions do you want to have answered about your program, about your organization, about your culture specifically, and let's derive a process and program from there. Let's start with what question you want answered, and then build the assessment to flow from that. Again, there's a lot of great partners in this space who can help organizations measure effectively, but it's their methodology. Lean into what you specifically want to accomplish, and don't just default to what your partner has to say. It may be weird coming from someone who's in this space and a vendor in this space, but certainly that's been one lesson learned that we've seen that can add more value if you think more diligently about that up front. And I'd say that the second biggest pitfall, again, this is in broad terms, is failing to prepare to act on what you measure. A lot of what we turned our focus to in terms of measuring companies, as I mentioned, is part of the world's most ethical companies process, is what are you doing after you measure? So tell us how you measure, the frequency, scope, and scale, as I discussed. What are you doing after the fact? How are you bringing in the right stakeholders? How are you preparing these stakeholders for change? How are you facilitating change? How are you acting on what you've measured? Tell us what your journey looks like from measurement to analysis to improvement. And a lot of organizations don't put the requisite time in thinking through what does that action planning process look like. Whether it be regional leaders aren't prepared to act on the data they receive, whether it is discovering your senior leadership team doesn't have the appetite to pursue some of the opportunities identified. This is a large undertaking, or can be, and if you don't dedicate the right resources and time to ensuring that what you receive is acted on and improved upon, it's all for naught. And sort of a small tactical implication of this as well is when you're finished doing, let's say, a survey, as the majority of respondents today have indicated they use, are you taking the time once that survey is complete to share what you found with employees? Are you spending moments, whether all employee newsletter, if you have an internet page, if you have a reoccurring perhaps town hall in which executives speak, are you using those forums to discuss what you've learned, what the employees have told you, what you plan on doing about it within some of those modalities? And the reason why that's so important, Tim, is a lot of organizations fall short in not sort of closing the feedback loop with employees in terms of sharing with what they've learned. And what that does is it really builds confidence from the employee standpoint of, okay, I'm being heard. My participation in this exercise was valuable. A lot of the questions asked as part of an ethical culture survey can be somewhat probative, and sensitive may be too strong of a word, but you are asking things like comfort in speaking up, perceptions of retaliation, thoughts about one's immediate manager, somewhat sensitive topics for someone who may be in a situation where they're not as comfortable, or maybe have experienced or seen something in those situations. So by allowing yourself to, or by communicating clearly with employees around the organization, you've been heard, here's what you told us is working, here's what's not working, here's what we want to do about it. You really, again, build trust in the process. You add that layer of transparency, and you allow for your next survey effort, you give employees a reminder that, hey, you participated, I was heard, I'm more likely to do this again next time around when it comes through. So that's sort of a more tactical pitfall that we've seen some companies make. We're commonly advising folks to pursue that, but it certainly can be a mistake if not pursued.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, just in my position at the company, your point on closing the loop, something I've made personal mistakes on, right? Like there's nothing that will frustrate people more than I told you my feelings and they were ignored. They weren't heard. I don't feel like they react to. And I think, as leaders or, anyone here, I feel you can't over communicate enough and through various channels, because there's the amount of times I've sat there and thought, I feel I did close the loop on it, but ultimately you have to own that, right? If they don't feel that on their side, then they don't feel that, and that feeling's valid and true. So it is, ultimately making sure we're very clear. Here's what we heard, and even if it's something you're not addressing, being explicit about, we heard this, and how we feel X, Y, or Z about that, but at least giving a response. No response is the worst response, and that's what really creates discontent. We run our own various surveys, well-being surveys, NPS surveys, and things of that nature. And I'm always intrigued by the feedback in those, because I 100% of the time just learn things that I was totally blind to. And then you schedule a town hall meeting, not everyone's there. You think, hey, I just talked about all the things that we're doing about this, someone missed it, they're not going to listen to the recording. So I think that backside of the communication is just absolutely critical. And then the different modalities part, I think, is something that, I hear a lot of struggle on. I think it's missed a lot, but I still get surprised by some of the things that I see, out in the market, whether it's, the particular tooling they're using or whatnot. But, people expect, however they're going to be communicated to be easy and, not a burden. So whether that is how you speak up or how you respond to a survey, how you, find out the information that you need, making sure that is accessible through, whether you're someone on the floor or you're someone sitting at a desk, and it's catering to these different workers. These are all things, and they're all really challenging problems, not to even get into predictions, but I do resonate with that quite a bit, as it's something that, I've learned the hard way, and, how you just really have to be clear with your organization and what actions you're taking and what actions you're also not taking. And I think the not taking part is often the thing that gets dropped off, is here's the things we're doing and then ignoring the things we're not doing.
Yeah, and especially the speak up context and the work you all do, Tim. It's the closing the loop is just foundational to having an effective process. Absolutely. It's funny, you gave an example, an anecdote that we actually use as sort of a case study on our side, where we measured for a few years in a row the ethical culture of a global, predominantly manufacturing company. They are based here in the US, but they have a presence around the world. And some of their, what we call, we break our methodology down into what we call the 8 pillars or themes of ethical culture, one of which is senior leadership perceptions. Do you view your senior leadership team as discussing integrity on a regular basis, and do they follow through that in action? And so this particular organization scored, let's say, notably below benchmark in that particular area. And the CEO was taken aback by that data. He's like, I don't understand. Every town hall, we discuss at the leading 3 minutes of every town hall is an integrity minute. We discuss the importance of our values and integrity specifically as a way in which we do business here. And come to find out, of the 100,000 plus employees around the world that were a part of this organization, they found out roughly 4 to 5% attended these town halls. So it speaks directly to, your message and your messenger might be on point. You've got the right wording, you've got the right message, you've got the right individual delivering it, but the modality is way off. And so from a context of messaging, we lean into what we call the 3 M's of messaging. So your messenger, modality, message, messenger, and modality. And so this was a case where the modality wasn't appropriate for the lived experience of employees, because 3-4% of the entire organization bothered to chime in on town halls or attend town halls. So the message wasn't being received, despite the CEO's effort of making it a priority.
And I have a question for you, because it's something, being on the tech side, we often, analytics, right? Like, how do I get all the data and reporting? I'd be curious of, any feelings you have on where is systems based, I'm talking, in a speak up system, reports per 100 employees and things of that, anonymous, not anonymous, things like that. Where are they useful and where are they not really telling you a lot?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it evokes kind of a broader framework of ethics compliance that we think about. So when we think of an effective compliance program and an effective or strong ethical culture, it really is comprised of sort of 3 legs of a stool. And you need all 3 legs of the stool, or else the stool will collapse. And that is, it's the environment. So the program in which you've built as a compliance professional. It's in turn, that environment then influences perceptions. So how are employees thinking and feeling about the work they're doing and the decisions they have to make? And then finally, what's the behaviors? What actions are they actually taking? So the environment influences perceptions, which in turn drive behaviors. And the case activity that you mentioned, Tim, really leans on that behavioral component. And so when at least when I think about, what levers, or when we assess companies broadly, we sort of take a lens at all 3 approaches, or all 3 legs of that proverbial stool. And again, the case activity piece is really on the behavioral side. So when it's certainly a good data point to evidence perceptions of what's happening, because if employees are feeling one way, they're going to act in a certain way as a consequence. But you have to be careful, as I'm sure you're well aware. You're more of an expert in this area than I am, but when you think about case activity, it's dangerous to lean on low is good, high is bad, or even vice versa, mainly because you don't know what's driving that low case activity. The All of the following as a thought experiment are equally valid explanation as to why you may have low case volume. It could be one, you have in fact a low instance of misconduct occurring, so there's no need to utilize a resource. It could be a fear of retaliation. Folks are just afraid of speaking up for, losing their job, losing the assignment, being relocated, what have you. There could be a lack of trust in the system. Why bother? Why raise my hand if I know nothing, or I feel that nothing would happen as a consequence of that? It could be employees are unaware of how to report. There could be a general unawareness of the resources available to them to ask or report something. It could be local cultural norms. My team, we just keep things internally. We fix our problems as a team. We don't need to bother corporate. It could be a misunderstanding of what misconduct even is. I thought I saw something. I don't know what I saw. I'm not going to bother. I don't think it was actually misconduct. So it could be a misunderstanding of what constitutes misconduct. Or it could just be plain old apathy, a disengagement on behalf of the employee. So in my mind, all those could be drivers for low activity rates on a hotline. So you've got to be careful in anchoring that as either favorable or unfavorable. But really, Tim, I'm curious for your perspective as, again, this is the world in which you live and I'm simply a bystander.
I agree with all of those. I'd add one thing that I don't see talked about a lot, and it's what is the experience for someone who actually has to do a report. And, I won't pick on anyone, but I'd say, if I look at the US, 70% of companies, if you go to their whistleblowing page and you pull it up on a mobile phone, it doesn't format. So you're creating barriers for people to even do it, right? Are we asking a million questions? Are we making it accessible for people? And I see this in, you look at some benchmark statistics that look at like phone versus web versus other things, and phone's way up here. It's like, well, how are we pathing people? Are we providing a consumer experience where am I reducing the friction from that process? Because the report is ultimately a lagging indicator, right? You only know after you got it. The reason for why not to report could be all of those things, or it's just frustrating to actually do it. I tried to do it on the web. It didn't work. I then called a phone number. I sat on hold, and it's just very, very frustrating. And I think, we really need to think, I come, a lot of my background's on the product side and, thinking of UX and design and things of that nature. And if you were to, it's funny in compliance, we don't think about, if you talk to a marketer, they are ruthless about any field they add onto a form. I've sat in meetings where it just gets debated about, because that'll hurt conversion rate. It's making money, so it gets a lot of attention. That conversation doesn't similarly happen. It's, I need to have all this information to route something a certain way, and not thinking about, how we balance that out to make sure we get the report and we can still solve the challenges that we have. So it's interesting just to sit across different contexts to see how, when people are building products for, consumer or things that are revenue generating, the amount of criticality that goes into that experience, and then oftentimes it gets totally forgotten on the other side. And there's plenty of modern ways of doing this, beyond the one that we offer. But I see a lot where finding the make a report button is not there. It's actually hard to find, and like if you have to click more than 3 or 4 times, like your people are going to drop off every data point. Tell you that. So that's another thing that I just think isn't talked about, as much as it could be.
Yeah, that's a great point. I imagine when you're in a situation to report, you're looking for any excuse to not do it. And if there's any friction involved, I imagine folks take that off ramp. It's curious, you mentioned modality too in this context. Just one insight from the data we measure, and I'm curious your take on this too, is we ask, so as part of our line of questioning when we partner with organizations is, as an employee, do you think you saw something in the past year? Yes, no, essentially. And if you have, did you report it? Yes, no. And if you did report it, tell us how you reported and what your experience was like. And if you look at the way in which employees engage with reporting misconduct, for every hotline call that they indicate making, 7 more go to their manager. And in European countries, it's higher. If you carve out the European section of our data set, it's closer to 10 or so. Folks go to the manager first. So it's, as you think through reporting modalities, Hotline is fundamental. You've got to have, to your point, a frictionless experience that is localized and ready to engage with employees where they're at. But secondly, also think through, are your people leaders prepared to take in these questions? Are they prepared to route folks to the hotline if need be? How are you preparing your immediate people leaders to be that conduit for your program, to set the local tone, to set the local culture, to be that resource for your employees? And so we always lean heavily on to the fact that, and our data bears this out, both quantitatively but anecdotally from the conversations we have, is just how important your managers are. And so when we think through a modality, it's it's crucial to have all your systems in a row and all of them operating effectively, essentially. So
Yeah,
I would agree.
totally agree. And I remember my first issue I had to deal with as a manager before I was even in this industry.
Mhm.
I had no idea what to do.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
and I
You're
think
not alone.
that's what a
Mhm.
lot of people deal with. And that's just the reality. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges of, I think people often mean, I believe most people really mean well and want to do the right thing. I think they often just don't know what that is. And that just goes back to everything we're talking about here.
Exactly. And Tim, to that point too, when we measure, one of our key pillars is organizational justice. What's your faith in the investigations process? If you raise your hand, do you think anything would happen? And we measure, our methodology follows a Likert scale, which means we have typically a strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. And a lot of organizations, or some organizations, will lean heavily into that neutral center option in the area of organizational justice because they don't know. Folks, they don't agree, but they don't necessarily disagree. And so having the transparency in place to support the fact that, yes, if you do something or say something, something will happen, is a very common recommendation we make based upon data. And it can be team specific as we break down and segment results by organization. Some divisions, some teams, some locations evidence more neutral or more unawareness of the process behind reporting. And that gives a great ample opportunity for organizations to improve through communications, as well as improving the way in which managers reference it and how often they do as well.
Yeah. So we got a question in on the Q&A.
Yeah.
I like to take these live. So, one of the question was, should other metrics, from people metrics like turnover, absence rates be used to measure culture, and how do you present this data, qualitative data as a snapshot on culture on a monthly basis?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. And this is one of our key indicators of really mature organizations, those who get this right, because it takes a degree of sophistication and capability that I think a lot of organizations are learning as we speak. So when we think of other metrics on culture, I had mentioned before that the best companies by our standard are using multiple modalities. As you can imagine, where the rubber hits the road is, how are those modalities or how are those inputs talking to one another? And so when organizations holistically look at culture, we see the best organizations taking something like their dedicated ethics compliance culture survey, layering that against how employees feel against, let's say, a quarterly engagement HR survey. So let's compare and contrast how perceptions are being measured across those two dimensions. Is job satisfaction or trust in manager relating to speak up comfort, for example? And so that's another perception dimension. Again, going back to my framework of environment, perception, and behavior. Looking at the behavior piece, the hotline data is, one of the key pieces of that puzzle. Secondarily, looking at your written standards, your policies, procedures, what are your click metrics behind those? Who's accessing them? How often? Who's downloading them? Is anyone reading them? Can you track specifics to team, to business line, to location, the engagement with those resources? Is also a key input as to whether or not folks are taking those materials in. Training completion, time to completion for your training courses. Are folks engaging with that reliably, efficiently? What are any corresponding quizzes or knowledge tests within those training environments? How are they performing on a team-wide basis? And how did that, again, compare to engagement or your culture survey data? We actually have I'm drawing a blank here, Tim, but we actually have a slide we put together that lists 2 or 3 dozen different inputs that we've seen companies use to kind of tie that picture together of holistic culture. Now, how do you do it on a monthly basis? That's a great question. It really comes down to, at least in my experience, to what extent does compliance at your organization have a reliable data team that they can lean on to dashboard appropriately? We see a mix of organizations with their sophistication behind. Do they have a Power BI resource? Do they have a Tableau resource? Can they get those inputs in a way in which they can report them out regularly? But it really comes down to what the capabilities are in the specific team. Tim, I'm curious, do you have any reactions or inputs on other things you've seen companies account for when measuring culture or
Yeah,
dimensions
I
of
mean, a lot of things that were
program?
mentioned here, a lot of HR
Mm,
data, coming into the
yep.
equations, a lot of things that you just mentioned there. And you're speaking from our company, we blend the same sort of stuff. So we run multiple different types of surveys. So well-being surveys, ethical cultural surveys, employee NPS surveys.
Yep,
It's always
exactly.
interesting to see the differences, but also the overlap between these and in how that works. I mean, we're a much smaller company, obviously, than
Yep.
large companies that deal with this, but we do see a trend towards, using these centralized reporting platforms like Power BI to feed data from what we
Yep.
do. There's even across, ethics and compliance, there's your hotline data, there's data on, conflicts, your training data, so on and so forth. So even all of
Yep.
that information, putting it together, breaking it down by business unit, site, geographic, so on and so forth, can help provide different perspectives on how things are in different countries, because there's going to be maybe different ways that you might want to address certain things in different areas. So and we've seen that trend just continue of people using more analytics, more bringing different data sets together into reporting tools, with Power BI by far being the most common one that we see people
Yeah,
move into.
completely agree.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
Great. So we're going to put up one more poll here, and then we're going to shift into the next topic. So we're gonna put that up, and then we'll loop back to it once we have some results in. But we wanted to shift into benchmarking and best practices. So Doug, I think this is right in your wheelhouse about world's most ethical companies. How do they track, improve, and how does the benchmarking all work? So take it away.
Yeah, Tim, if you don't mind, I'm going to rewind just a few seconds.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
actually found my slide with other inputs that I've seen companies use. I was curious. I know I was coming short in my list. So I'm going to rattle these off in kind of a lightning round fashion. But I think you mentioned from a compliance data standpoint, there's case management data, training completion speed. I mentioned engagement with your communications, your open rates for your emails coming out of the ENT program. Are you measuring those? Are folks reading the newsletter? Conflicts of interest disclosure patterns, frequencies, volume, and so on. Gift entertainment disclosures and exception requests. Manager turnover by region or area. Are you seeing elevated turnover rates in specific teams? What are the perceptions of those teams measured through survey? We've seen some companies input things like phishing test failure rates as kind of an input, as well as to engagement in awareness broadly. For those with manufacturing presences, what's your safety near miss data? What's coming through with regards to reports you're seeing on that side of the house? Vendor due diligence data and audit areas, litigation patterns. The list goes on. I'm not going to bore the audience with everything, but yeah, I had to pull that up, Tim, just for my own
No, appreciate it.
completion. Yes. So how are companies measuring was the question, I believe.
In
So
benchmarking and best practices.
benchmark.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that invokes sort of a broader question of, we've already talked about measuring. The benchmarking question is really a question of, what does good look like? So I've measured my ethical culture. I've kind of taken a sense of the temperature of the organization, of my teams. What does good look like? And there's a few different ways you can kind of get a sense of what that means. And benchmarking data is the one in which we rely on the most and lean on the most. So when thinking through benchmarking and why it's important, this is all fairly intuitive. So if, as an example, you've gone through an effort to measure, let's say, the perceptions of speaking up or awareness of your written standards. So are folks engaging with, are aware of the fact you have a code of conduct, and you've got a 90% value. Let's say 90% of your company is in alignment, that they're aware of and understand the code and how it relates to their job. Is 90% good? I would argue, or our benchmarking shows that if you're a manufacturing company, that's great. If you're perhaps a IT-heavy software company, that's less great by comparison. And so having a contextual benchmark to provide a lens with which to view results is crucial to figuring out if there's more of a there than what you expect. And so we, again, lean on benchmarking. We're fortunate to have a benchmark data set that we can filter and provide contextual results for organizations based on sector, size, and relevancy that we pull from. And for the audience today, we have a variety of resources on our website. I believe, Tim, we're going to link to those as part of this discussion in some modality. But we've published a lot of resources that kind of give you a sense of what that benchmarking is broadly. And so I would encourage the audience to take that in. We have what's called our 8 Pillars report that highlights, for all those 8 key themes we measure, here's some high-level benchmark data points that we have that may help illustrate for your own efforts what may be good or less good in the context of benchmarking. But we use it as a key indicator of what good looks like. Obviously, if you've had a chance to measure over time, what's the longitudinal story behind your data? So year over year, what's the trend behind increases or decreases in perception in various areas? That's another kind of indicator of what good looks like. And so those combined, I think, help tell the story of what your program is and what it's doing successfully. And we use it both on the measuring culture side, but again, going back to the world's most ethical programs perspective, we benchmark and measure what the current state of a program is and what organizations or what compliance leaders are doing with respect to their program. How often are you training your managers? What does that training look like? What's the investigations process? How are you supporting it? How are you conducting root cause analysis behind situations that occur? So all that kind of, again, contextualizes what good looks like. We're very happy to share a lot of that resourcing, publicly through our website. And again, I mentioned we'll provide some resources that illustrate some of these data points as well as part of today's conversation.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So going back to the poll, which I find this interesting. The question was, what's the biggest challenge in your organization's speak up culture? So the options were fear of retaliation, lack of leadership support, unclear metrics, low engagement, low confidence or unawareness of reporting in systems, and lack of management engagement or training. And this one there's clear 2 that are far beyond anyone else. Number 1, with 38% fear of retaliation, and number 2, low confidence or unawareness of reporting. Doesn't surprise me much, especially, fear of retaliation, I always think is an interesting one because it feels logical to feel that way, to a certain degree. You've seen, movies, you've had peers, like it makes sense that's a fear in people's head. But Doug, I'm curious, your reaction to that.
Yeah, not to give myself too strong of a pat on the back, but I was working with your team, Tim. We were thinking about what to do for the second poll for this discussion today. And I added the low confidence or unawareness of reporting option as sort of a last second addition, thinking this may come up as a predominant response. So I'm glad to see my intuition manifested itself in the results here. I'm not surprised at all. So if you look at our culture data set broadly, the top 3 reasons why folks say they don't report, we ask again through a chain of questions. Did you see something? Did you report it? Yes, no. Why not? For those who say no. And the most common reasons given are fear of retaliation in order, which is about 47% or so of those. Looking at the European data set only, by the way. So if you look at European respondents from our data set, 47% say, I got the order wrong. They don't believe anything will happen. So that's actually the most common result for folks based out of the EU, or the European area. Number 2 is retaliation. About 42% of those who don't report say that's why they don't report. This is multi-select, by the way, which is why the percentages exceed 100. And then the 3 is they didn't want to bring it up to the manager. There was a lack of confidence in bringing it to their manager, or the issue involves someone senior to them within their team. They didn't feel comfortable speaking up, speaking out. And this aligns very closely with our global data set as well. So if you look at all data, not just European-based respondents, retaliation is number 1. Number 2 is lack of faith that anything would happen. And then 3, it's the didn't want to report to my manager directly out of lack of confidence. And so again, not surprised with this. But zooming out a little bit from this data though, Tim, what one trend we see oftentimes is what we call a confidence and speaking up gap in our data. So what we do is we ask respondents, if you hypothetically see something, what's your willingness to raise your hand and say something? And as you can imagine, we get 92 or so % of employees say, of course, if I see something, I'm gonna raise my hand, I'm gonna speak up, I'm gonna speak out. Absolutely. Through our questions, as we get further into our assessment, we ask, as I mentioned, did you see something? Yes, no. And for those who did see something, we ask them a follow-up. Did you actually report what you saw? And that gets less than half. Less than half of those individuals, more specifically 47%, say, nope, or rather, yes, I did report. So more than half aren't reporting what they saw. So we see this confidence gap everyone thinks in the moment or outside of the moment, they're going to raise their hand and say something. But for those who find themselves in a situation where there's a need to speak up, less than have to. And so we try to get deep as to what's driving that. And as I've mentioned, the reasons we commonly see are it's the fear of retaliation and a lack of faith anything would happen if I raise my hand and speak up. So as you think through impediments to your own speak up culture, odds are one of those two reasons are a key driver behind that, as evidenced in our data broadly, but also in many instances in many of the companies we look at specifically.
Yeah, I'm just curious, sitting on your side, how do you what are some best practices people can implement, specifically on fear of retaliation, to overcome that? Because I think some of that leads into leadership support and other things as well. But I'm curious of thoughts you have on that topic.
Yeah, you nailed it, Jim. Leadership support is the anchor or the point in which we usually start with, both from a tone from the very top of the organization, but again, going back to the importance of one's immediate manager, what's that tone from the middle? What's the local team tone as being set by the immediate manager? That's usually where we start when this arises. Specifically, how are you preparing your people leaders to be that voice, to be that advocate for their employees so that they understand retaliation is not tolerated? And so when retaliation concerns come up, we actually ask a variety of different questions to kind of get around that or to get deeper into that topic, starting with, are you aware of the fact there's a policy on this within your organization? What's your faith in that policy being enacted? And then what's your perception of your manager as being an advocate or supporting you if fear of retaliation is evident within you? And so we really look at those data points as sort of where to go next as well. But from a tone from starting with the senior leadership perspective, this leads me to another trend, which kind of touches on retaliation concerns as well, as we have what's called the say-do gap from a leadership perspective. So two key questions when looking at perceptions of the senior leadership team. One is, from your perspective as an employee, does your senior most leadership team, are they discussing integrity on a regular basis? Is it part of the vernacular? Are they making it a part of their communication talk track? What's your perception of that? Secondarily, we ask, do you believe your senior leadership team is acting in a way that's in alignment with that message of integrity? And if you look at our benchmark data broadly, there's a 10-point gap between those two dimensions, as in roughly 83% or so of employees say, yes, my senior leadership team is advocating values and integrity consistently, but are they acting on a regular basis? That drops down to about the low 70% in terms of agreement with those statements. And so what's driving that lack of agreement for whether or not senior leadership team is acting is a lot of neutral responses. Folks don't know. And so again, getting at that point specifically about retaliation broadly is, can you equip your senior leadership team and your local leadership team, your people leaders across your enterprise, to lean more into stories, to lean more into case studies and anecdotes as to sharing their decision-making process? Can they give examples of what they've done, how they've tackled integrity challenges themselves? What were the consequences as a result of that, to help evidence the fact that, one, it's not tolerated. Two, when things come up and are reported, actions are being taken. And when you provide that layer of transparency into reporting as a process, but also the outcomes of that, you really build trust in the system, which again allows folks to address that fear of retaliation by showing through examples, through case studies, what does transpire once reports take place. Secondarily to that is sharing data. We push for organizations to really make a concerted effort to share what's taking place from a reporting perspective. Are you sharing with your employees to the extent that you can? I know this sometimes makes legal teams squirm a little bit, but can you share some of the volume you're seeing from a reporting standpoint? Can you share some of the consequences of those reports? How many were substantiated? What were some examples of consequences taking place? To again, give evidence to the fact this is a system that works. It's a system you can trust. And oh, by the way, if you do find yourself in a position where you're reporting something and it's about a team member or a colleague you're in the vicinity of, you make that report and you see this individual still in place 2-3 weeks later, your perception is, all right, well, nothing happened. My voice wasn't heard. But if you can equip employees with the knowledge of, termination isn't the only outcome from this process. There could be coaching, there can be training. There could be other consequences that don't result in termination. Again, you build transparency, you build trust in this process, which allows folks to, I think, address some of that underlying concern of retaliation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think you triggered something in my mind of just, I was visiting one of our customers. I think someone that we both work with actually, and they did exactly what you say. They share their information publicly, but also they created these great training assets that really went through things specifically that were pulled from their system and turned those into, really, I mean, everyone's got different budgets, but really high quality videos where there were senior people and then walking through, a gift, like a gift example and where that went wrong and how it was investigated. Here was the outcome. For
exactly.
I think it's one of the things that people just don't know. And I've seen this with friends of mine where, like, when I put this in, like, what happens, and it's the fear of the unknown. Of there's awareness on the Speak Up program, the posters and all this, but what actually happens when I do it? I think definitely is something that creates fear in people as well. And people often go to their darkest places, right? So I think all of those things are great ideas. I'm just looking at
Tim, I have an example too.
Okay, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So there's a perennial honoree on our list of world's most ethical companies, publishes publicly a great example of what this report of sharing hotline data could look like. So, after today's session, I would encourage everyone to Google the Care First annual Speak Up report. It's a great example of what an organization has done to illustrate what does transpire from that reporting system and process in an effort to build transparency. So that's just a great kind of example in the wild of what we've seen our organization do that and do it well in this area.
Yeah. Got a couple good questions. So we're gonna have we got two questions here, and then we'll wrap things up. Just looking at time. The first one is just very specific about that. Do you cut on your benchmarking by modes of work? So on-site versus hybrid versus fully remote. Is that that you're looking at?
Yeah, we do. So we've taken the approach of, as we measure or partner with companies to measure, we meet companies where they are to measure in a way that makes sense to them. And as part of that process, the methodology we bring to bear is somewhat configurable. And as part of that, we allow organizations to configure the demographic dimensions that are most important to them to capture as part of this process. So the flexibility is good. The bad part of that equation is we sometimes lack consistency in demographic dimensions. And so I bring this up to mention that not everyone, rather, it's a minority of organizations include that dimension within their data set. So we do have some data on it, but it's not consistently measured. And so we don't have, I would say, a data-based, a data-driven reaction to that question that I can speak intelligently about in any meaningful way. But we do get it cut fairly often, increasingly so as organizations still grapple with remote work and hybrid work. But as you can imagine, just intuitively, the approaches needed for on-site versus hybrid versus fully remote are very different and disparate in terms of communicating or building culture, communicating compliance, and so on. But Tim, you must encounter the same issue on your side, same challenge on your side with respect to how folks are managing speaking up.
Definitely a challenge. I mean, we think about it use more from the whole thing I mentioned on friction. How do you get the report and offering? You're meeting people where they are. I truly believe in that, and I'm a big believer in the way people use consumer tools or the way people need to use business tooling, right? Mm-hmm. So you have, you're using QR codes. Are you, deploying things that are more responsive? Do you have app? Are you having, a call operator that sounds like it's from the, 80s? Or are you doing something more digital and adapt in language, right? So there's so many friction points. How do you break that down? And then that gets into, desk workers versus other workers. So we see companies grapple with this all the time. Not to get into all the technicals, things like device management come into play, kiosks, having local people who can take in reports and trusted things in the supply chain get complicated. So it's an ongoing problem, and there's not always easy solutions to these things. In my prior life on the training side, this came up quite a bit of offline learners versus online learners, and how do you how do you keep track of all these and deliver it in the right way without having to fly people out? So it's a challenge, and I think it's ultimately, from where I sit, really understanding, who your different personas are, and then thinking of different journeys for those different personas, and not trying one size fits all approach. Whether it's with technology or anything else. So just looking at questions here, this one I think is really interesting. A challenge for using case studies, is integrity talk track. Is there often negative, like someone being terminated? What are some ideas on the positives of acting with integrity? And I don't know if you have any specific examples of that as well.
Sort of. A few things we've seen work really well is if and this doesn't get around the negative versus positive question, but if leaders can pull from personal anecdotes that they've experienced and sort of decisions they've grappled with and made, and be transparent about that resonates. Employees can detect authenticity. I mean, I think as humans, we're pretty well wired to detect, especially when it's coming from that level of an organization. If leaders can speak authentically about experiences they've had and ethical dilemmas they've faced and decisions they've made, to be transparent about the process and outcomes from that, and to place the value of doing things right as a result, that tends to stick really well. Again, that doesn't get around the negative talk track bit. What I've seen work well, because to this participant's point, most of the anecdotes around this is in fact negative. We've seen organizations pull from other publicly available case studies from outside their organization, but relevant to their space. Like, look, this is what our competitor did. This is what another manufacturing company did. That was wrong. They were penalized for it. As a reminder, we don't do this here. This is not who we are, as a reminder. And it's a great opportunity to kind of pull from little schadenfreude, using someone else's misfortune to kind of remind folks of the values inherent in their own organization. So it's, again, not getting more in the positive, but more deflecting the negative outside your walls if you'd like to. Or if you're small and, of course, you're not in a position to anonymously discuss something that may have happened, because, again, given the size of an organization, that may not be an option. But we've seen that work well. Other ways in which kind of leaning on the positive side is, this isn't necessarily a case study per se, but one great story I heard was there was a situation in this organization that transpired. The individual saw it, reported it, ended up not being an issue, but they did make the effort to make the call and report what they saw. After that, a member of the board of directors of this company personally called that individual employee to thank them for what they did. Say, hey, I understand this is what came up, and you made the effort to report what you saw. Thank you. This is in line with our values. We do what's right, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't a lot of explicit fanfare behind it, but as you can imagine, that employee spread that word pretty quickly. When those little interactions take place that are very personal, it became a very positive sort of through the grapevine story that permeated the team and outside the team as well. So that's, again, I'm kind of dodging the question with bad examples, but those are examples of what I've seen work well.
Appreciate that. Appreciate it. And thank everyone for their questions as they came in. Looking at the clock here, we're going to wrap up. I hope everyone got a lot from this. I certainly have enjoyed the conversation, talking about everything from benchmarking to, what a good culture looks like, measuring. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope everyone took something away from this. I would just say definitely download Ethisphere's benchmark report. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. I love the content, as well as we have our Speak Up's guide on improving spam. So feel free to check that out, and feel free to connect with Doug or myself with anything that comes up after. And again, thank you everyone for joining.
Please.
Hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all. Appreciate it.